Today we're building a full-stack AI assistant for hotels completely from scratch. I'm going to show you how to use Cursor to vibe code this starter app using PydanticAI, FastAPI, and ReactJS. This is perfect if you're a founder looking to quickly bring your ideas to life. I'll walk you through everything: crafting effective prompts, understanding why context matters so much, and yes, I'll show you where things can get wrong too. Because let's be real, that's where most of the learning happens. Stick around and I'll promise you'll walk away with skills to save hours on your next project. Whether you're building an AI SaaS app for hotels like in this example, or any other app that you're passionate about. Hit that subscribe button and let's get coding. Your future users are waiting. Before we dive in, let me give you a quick preview of what we're building today. Here's our finished product: a sleek React app with custom components and a color scheme that we actually specified right in our prompt. You can see we've got this nice chat interface with message bubbles and input box at the bottom. Behind the scenes, it's using FastAPI to connect with our PydanticAI agent in real time, handling all of the hotel assistant logic. The interface is fully responsive and built on a modern stack. We used React with Vite for fast development experience, ShatCN for clean UI, and Tailwind CSS for styling. Now, let's see how we built this from scratch. But before we start, let me tell you about the new school program that I've started. AI Software Developers is a community of AI builders, entrepreneurs, and self-starters that goes beyond the basic AI concepts. Unlike other programs, we dive deep into aspects, technical and business, helping you build a thriving AI product or SaaS enterprise. So what do you get when you join? You get exclusive content not available elsewhere, masterclasses on PydanticAI, LangGraph, AI agent, startups, and more. You get thousands of templates of source code assets, AI agent templates, vibe coding rules and tasks, prompt libraries, and more. Don't get left behind in the AI revolution happening right now. Join today and lock in the low prices before rates increase. Transform your career, launch your startup, and revolutionize your business with skills that will define the next decade in technology. So, how did we actually build this thing? We started with a prompt. And for most founders, crafting that prompt is probably going to be one of the most important parts in your workflow. When it comes to how much detail to put in the prompt writing, be sure to watch the rest of this tutorial to see how much effort we put into the prompt and how much time it saved us from debugging and troubleshooting problems later. We didn't get it 100% right, and that's part of the lessons learned. In this video, you'll be seeing the behind-the-scenes knowledge that separates quick builds from hours of painful debugging. So stick around to catch every detail. Once ready with the prompt, we asked Cursor to generate the code. After the code was ready, we gave it a quick spin and it didn't look great. We debugged the issues, fixed the missing libraries, tested again, and this time it worked. I have a slide to describe the process, but that's basically the core of our workflow we followed in this session. Let's talk about the thinking process we followed for this particular session. When you start building an application from scratch and you have no code at that point, one of the first things that you do is come up with the idea for the core functionality of the app. You don't yet have features, but you have a general vague idea of some of the core value that this app should provide to users. So I call that the main idea of the app. And it's good to start with this idea in mind. Next, it's probably a good idea to choose your vibe coding tool. As much as this presentation and others will be focused on the process over the tools, it's a good idea to actually do a little bit research because new tools come online every day. Just like Google recently announced the Firebase Studio, a new vibe coding tool that is going to shape up the industry for the next couple of years, as it seems. For this session, we chose Cursor because it's one of the more established tools. So it's a good idea to just look at the tool that you're going to be using and try to understand some of its capabilities, such as agentic project creation. Once you have the tool ready, now it's time to think about the tech stack. And in our case, we determined that our tech stack will be composed from Pydantic, React, and FastAPI. But it's a good idea to do a little bit of research. Every time you create a vibe coding project, it's a good idea to actually have at least some basic knowledge about the tech stack and some of the tools that you'll be using during the process. Next up is setting up the context. So this is really important, and setting up the context in the tool. And that happens by providing documents, rules, and tasks files to Cursor. So there are 3 things that are important, and I'll show you in the video later on how we set the context for Cursor. Once you have the context, it's time to write that prompt. Prompt writing will likely occupy most of your time. And this is where it gets interesting because you have a choice to make. You can spend time writing a good prompt, or you can spend that time debugging. It's a trade-off. And it's a good idea to spend as much time as you can writing a good prompt, as detailed, as prescriptive as possible to minimize the debugging that will ensue later on. Once you have your prompt ready, it's time to generate the code. That's very simple. Cursor supports agentic code creation. Once you start the generation process, it will go ahead and create everything for you. Occasionally, it will ask for input, so you can review the code. That's very important so that you understand what's going on, the files created, and you're happy with the interim results. Once the code is created and reviewed by you, then it's time to run it. So the earlier you can run the code, the better. That way you can catch the errors early. In many cases, especially when you're creating full stack applications with UI, databases, and integrations, it's highly unlikely that everything will run perfectly the first time. You will probably hit a snag here and there, and it's a good idea to ask Cursor or another tool to resolve those issues from the terminal. You will get those issues, and they can be quite pesky in the beginning, especially if you're non-technical. With a little bit of practice, with a little bit of patience, and using the tool properly, you can debug these issues very quickly. And then once you get to a stage where the code looks okay and the UI looks okay-ish, it's time to commit your code. Commit it locally, do not push it remotely just yet. This will be a small milestone. And with this milestone, it's also time to ask Cursor to generate testing artifacts. These are going to be important during the refactoring phase, but it's a good idea to generate some tests, automated tests, functional integration unit, you name it, but just generate some tests there too. Run the tests. If everything passes, commit the code. Finally, look at the project structure, and that's what we did also. And in some cases, you may not like the organization. So for example, when you're creating multi-tier applications, you may choose to call your server folder a server, your client folder a client, and the API folder an API. However, the tool may choose different names. So you may ask for a refactoring, and having a good test base ensures that the results of your refactoring effort will always be valid. Once that's done, you're pretty much done with the project, and you go into the feature mode, which I will explain later on. It's slightly different. This process is creating an app from scratch, and there are no features. You just created a blank boilerplate app with one screen perhaps. All right, let's move on. During this process, our tech stack was chosen to be a multi-layer, basically 3 layers. On the front layer, we chose React with Vite, ShadCN, and Tailwind CSS. You have a choice when it comes to front-end frameworks, and there are multiple frameworks that would fit the bill. We just chose this because I'm familiar with React and Vite, and it was something that Cursor is quite good at generating. So also, it's a good idea when you use Cursor and the model that you choose. And in our case, we chose the Anthropic 3.7 with thinking enabled. It's important that the model knows and understands the tech stack so that the assets generated reflect that knowledge. On the middleware, we settled with FastAPI, one of the options for creating APIs. And for the agents, we settled with PydanticAI using OpenAI's GPT-4o mini model. Now, those boxes on the bottom, we didn't get a chance to implement yet, but they will be implemented in the next set of videos. So integrations with databases, email providers, and potentially payments. By integrating payments, you would give your chatbot the ability to book rooms on behalf of the customers or the hotel attendants. These boxes will be implemented later, but this is basically our tech stack. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we did the prompt writing. We started with a prompt that I've already had done for my PydanticAI agents and started adding more details to this prompt. As you can see, the main details were the layers of the app. I had created this single agent prompt. And I knew that this creates good single purpose PydanticAI agents. But since now we're using FastAPI as well as React, I needed to supplement this prompt with more details. This is where you need to take care of the details and provide as much detail to the tool as possible. Now, the entire prompt will be available to our school members, so you can grab it from there and try to recreate it. You can just see the level of detail that I'm putting here. And even with this level of detail, because it didn't include the versions, it was struggling to match the right version of Tailwind CSS with the React version and some of the other front-end frameworks such as ShadCN. It's very important to write a descriptive prompt to tell Cursor, even to the level of the version numbers, which you'd like to use for this stack. Another potential way of how to deal with this is to use the CLI tools for the stack provided. This was also a method that was suggested by one of our members. So instead of asking Cursor to create everything from scratch, the other way to do this is to use create Next.js app, and then with the right options for Tailwind CSS and the libraries and ShadCN to get to that level. But for this, we assume that we're a non-technical co-founder and we wanted to use Cursor to do everything for us, and it did a pretty decent job. This is the prompt writing process. Once you're ready with the prompt, you're ready to move on to set the context inside Cursor. What does context setting mean? When you open Cursor and in the chat box, you have this little option called add context. And if you look at the add context, you get different options. You can add files, you can add web doc routes, you can add the built-in documentation for the tools that you use. I've already added the PydanticAI as well as the Next.js and perhaps Tailwind CSS and ShadCN. You can add them to the context, and if they don't exist, you can just create a new doc route and add, for example, FastAPI. You can add that and it will become available to the tool for your usage. Context setting is super important. That way you tell Cursor exactly the tools that you need and exactly the versions, and it has access to the API documentation, so it does not hallucinate and it does not give you some wrong code for the application. Preventing hallucinations and preventing stale versions, older versions of the documentation is really important. And that's why you should set the context as much as possible for the entire stack. By the same token, right now, what you're looking at is the model selection. You can select your model. We settle with Claude 3.7 Sonnet. Within thinking, I don't normally enable auto select because I want to have a tight control both on the model but also on the costs. And this entire build end-to-end consumed 24 premium prompts. So just to give you an idea, it created a React app, it created a FastAPI endpoint, and it created the PydanticAI agent. And that's a total of a couple of hundred files, and all working with the debugging and everything. 24 premium credits is what it took. Obviously, you can choose different models from here, but this is basically what you need to do. Once your prompt is ready, context setting is the next important task in Cursor. Let's move on now to the actual code generation. You have your prompt, you have your context set. Now it's time to launch it. So you paste your prompt into the chat box and you hit generate. One of the first questions Cursor will ask you is it will come up with a plan and it will ask you to approve the plan. So what you're looking at the screen here is the full stack agent application plan. I really like this about Cursor and some other tools, but this is where you can review this: the project structure setup, the PydanticAI agent implementation, the FastAPI backend development, React frontend with ShadCN, and integration and testing. So you can review this list here. And if something is missing, in retrospect, I now see that the Tailwind CSS integration is missing, and we could have prompted to add Tailwind CSS right there to make sure that the version numbers are matching and everything will work well together. But that's something to be learned. But basically review this plan, and once everything looks good, approve it so that Cursor then goes into its agent mode, and in agent mode, it starts generating these files. And now it starts generating the source code assets. As you can see on the screen, and I've accelerated this to save time, but different folders are now being created. The agent folder is created and the hotel_agent.py file is already ready. Then the agent app folder is created and then the API folder is created. So we have 3 folders already. The API folder has a main.sh file as well as main.py file. That's the FastAPI server. And then it created another folder called client. And the client is where it's generating the React Vite code. That's also really good. Yeah, so basically that's how the generation goes. Now let's move on to running the app. Once the code generation is done, it's time to give it a spin. This is the first time you'll be running the app. Remember that there are 3 components to run in this app. And these components are the front end, the React front end, the FastAPI backend, as well as the agent itself. And for the agent, you don't have to run anything specifically because the FastAPI will have access to our agent code. But just remember that at least 2 items need to be run. So one thing that Cursor does really well is that it is able to run terminal commands. As you can see here, it's already running Vite, and we have our server running on localhost colon 5173. So that's the port. And there is a small error here, as you will notice in the chat interface.tsx file. Sometimes these are just false positives. So you can ignore it for now because there's no issue with ESLint or something else here. Cursor gets confused and there is no impact on you or on the execution of the project. You can tackle it later. If it still gives that error, you can ask Cursor to fix it. But usually these are just linter errors that have basically no impact on the running of the app. So I'll just ignore that for now, but make sure that the app is running. So you can just click that and follow the link and open a browser and ensure that everything is working as expected. It will also provide you a list of the tools that you need to be running. So you need to make sure to install the requirements for the API and the agent code. So I'll go ahead and do that. And here we're running into an error. And as you can see, there is an error with the versioning. So if you go and inspect the requirements.txt, oftentimes you will see mismatched versions or hallucinated version numbers. We're going to open requirements.txt later on. I'll show you. And then we'll just remove some of those incompatible version numbers like this. And we'll just leave one version that is for the PydanticAI 0052. And the rest we'll just let pip determine the most compatible version. Now, this is not a best practice. I'm not recommending you do this for production, but our aim here was to make this vibe coding session successful and to make something that works. So that way we can just get rid of the versions. And once we have a combination that works, it's always a good idea to settle those versions in requirements.txt, or if you're using Poetry or UV, always go with a known set of version numbers. That way you can control them and you can check that into GitHub and have a good, well-known configuration. But once we fix this, now the system is running. And so our backend is running, our front end is running, and now we can actually go and see what's going on in our system. For that, we're just going to go ahead and look at some of the other files and inspect these files and see if there are any other issues. Going through these files, we're discovering that everything is fine. The agent code is fine and there are no issues. Time for us to launch the browser and see what else is going on. There were some little issues with the FastAPI there, but they were fixed later on once the libraries were installed and the correct versions were installed. So we're just going to run the command one more time. So it's a good idea to sometimes just restart the server after you do a little bit of debugging. And that way you can just go and refresh the page and you'll see that things are now working. And that's how we run the app. Let's go ahead and see the results of our first test. As you can see, it doesn't look great. It's not following our instructions for the user interface. The fonts are not looking good. The colors are not looking good. But more importantly, when we type the message hi, it didn't go through. Something is wrong with our API server. And you can inspect that by right-clicking on your browser and going to the network tab as we're doing. And we're seeing that the request URL localhost 5173/API/chat is throwing a 500 error. So that's a server error. So that's something that we need to find out what's going on and debug. But that's our first chat. And once we debug that and once we fix that, we do another chat request and we get a green 200 OK, as you can see. And now our chatbot is working. So it's very important to make sure that first the agent is working, secondly, the API is working, and thirdly, the UI is able to display these messages in the chat window. Now, the styling, we still have issues with styling, and we'll tackle that later, but at least the core logic right now is working. Let's move on. At this point, we're going to start debugging the UI issues. Tailwind CSS and ShatCN are not properly recognized by our system, and that's what we need to resolve. We do a little bit of debugging and we do a little bit of asking Cursor to solve our problems by using the Tailwind CSS. We make sure that Tailwind CSS is still in the context. We're asking that the new Tailwind CSS is different. Can you please adapt the code to the latest version to ensure that everything is working, Cursor is working. Sometimes, again, it goes into loops. And this is one of those situations where despite multiple tries, both to use the latest version, but also to downgrade, we couldn't actually make React and Tailwind work together. When everything else fails and you start getting these red screens, nothing is working, it's okay to go to Google or to Stack Overflow and start looking for solutions. And indeed, our solution turned out to be in one of the GitHub repos and found this answer. Basically, the question was already asked. I ran into the same issue, something with postcss.config. And all we needed to do was to rename postcss.config.js to postcss.config.cjs. So just renaming one file. Cursor couldn't figure that out. It took a little bit of Googling. It took a little bit of a Stack Overflow, and we landed on this GitHub issue. And once we read the issue, as you can see, 84 thumbs ups and 56 stars. So people already have gone through this issue, and we renamed the file manually, and boom, at that point, everything worked as expected. Sometimes, despite best effort and despite best prompting, you may not be able to resolve the issue, and there's no shame in going to good old Google or ChatGPT and ask for a solution, especially with ChatGPT. If you enable web search and enable GitHub or Stack Overflow, you'll probably get to a solution. Now that we had that, it was time to do our second test, and the second test surely looked much better than the first one. These colors are arbitrary colors. We just asked for pastel colors, and the hotel name is arbitrary. Cursor picked the hotel name for us. This looks a lot closer to a classic chatbot interface. There's a scroll bar. It does follow the system prompt. The chatbot is asking for a full name and a phone number as we instructed it to do. And everything seems to be working okay for a single use chatbot. So this is good. It took a few cycles to get here, especially with the debugging, but now it looks okay. It looks like we've accomplished the mission for this vibe coding session. We're not done yet though. Let's review the code structure and the folder structure. When we go to Cursor and we look at the code structure, we see that there is room for improvement. I personally do not like this code structure because first of all, we have the agent folder and the hotel agent Py is there. Then we have the agent app, and inside agent app, we have another agent API client, and then we have another API and client. Quite frankly, it's messed up, and we need to refactor this, and we will refactor this later on. It's important that at this stage where we have the app working okay, we generate a number of tests, perhaps a functional test or a unit test or something along those lines, and then we check in our code, because vibe coding and tools like Cursor are known to override entire apps when they're working, and then it gets very difficult to get back to the last known state. So it's important to check in, and in that case, if things go bad, then you can just revert to the last good version. Okay, there's quite a bit of room for improvement in this folder structure, and we're going to tackle that the next time. But let's just take a look at some of the other things that can be improved in this app. Now, we started with a very basic idea for a chatbot interface. We have a hotel, we have an attendant that will use this chatbot interface to help guests, or potentially this chatbot can be exposed through the hotel's main website to customers to book new rooms or to get a receipt or to get some other information about the hotel. What we did so far was we just generated one agent with PydanticAI with one tool. The tool itself included a mock database, so it responded to the questions for booking questions with its own mock data. So it's not connected to a database. The FastAPI endpoint talks to the agent, and then we have a user interface that is simple chatbot interface built in React. The good news about this stack is that it's a very solid stack. It's a production grade stack. You can trust this stack to add new features, and you can grow this into a application that can support literally millions of users. This is not a toy app. It can be made into an enterprise grade app. The tech stack is solid. What we haven't added is we haven't generated tests. So the next step would be generating some vibe tests. We haven't done refactoring, so cleaning up the structure is very important. We also need to refine the UI components. There's obvious details that are lacking. This is not a polished user experience. This is a starter user experience. The colors, they will have to comply with the corporate colors of the hotel perhaps, or a color schema. But ChatCN supports themes, and in the themes, you can define primary, secondary, and many other colors. We need to commit the code to GitHub and add new features, such as DB tool for booking. So connecting it to a real database would make this tool a lot more realistic. Which actually brings me to the next topic. We talked about how to add features, but I want to highlight it one more time here in this diagram. Adding a feature is different than starting an app from scratch, because when you have nothing in your workspace, you just saw what Cursor did. It starts creating the entire structure and it gives you a full app working. However, adding a feature is different, and there is a different workflow here. The difference is you start from a known code base, and Cursor needs to include a little bit of context and history of what's been done so far and what the feature is. So my best practices or recommendations for this red box here is start with the feature idea and generate user stories. Use something like ChatGPT or Claude to generate the feature description, to generate a couple of user stories, and to generate a little bit of a history context. The history context is basically what's being done to this point. You can do that manually, or you can ask in your main prompt for Cursor to keep a file, an MDC file called history log. So it logs every step. And this is important for continuity. One of the issues with adding new features to apps when they start growing is that Cursor forgets what it's been done before. It just looks at the code base and it doesn't have any knowledge of the prior history. And the way to do that is by adding a history.mdc file, which includes step-by-step what's being done. For example, in this app, you could include something like, I've created a blank React Vite project. I've added Tailwind CSS, I've added ChatCN, I've then created a FastAPI endpoint, and then I've created a PydanticAI agent that works with OpenAI's GPT-4o mini model to answer hotel-related questions. This is a reasonable history prompt. Once you add a new feature, for example, connect the agent to a real database. Also add that to the end of the file so that the history log keeps growing, and then prompt Cursor next time you start a new session to always read the history log first and familiarize itself with the steps that have been done before, and then continue from the last step. If things change, go back and update the history file. But this history file will be the glue. It will be so important when you start adding new features. And if you're like me, you grow apps incrementally. You don't build everything in one day. So what you do is you start with a core, and then you add features as you go, MVPs, version 1s, 2s. And as it grows, that history file will become so important. Okay, next, let's talk about some of the lessons learned. Number one is choose your stack wisely, because you're going to live with your stack for a long time. It's important to start with a stack that is enterprise ready, that can support your growth, and it can support thousands, if not millions of users. Do a little research, whether you're technical or non-technical. It's important to do the research when you're picking your stack. I'll give you an example. Although I love tools like Streamlit and Gradio, I wouldn't build my next enterprise app using those tools as a UI stack. Why? Because there are limitations. React, Next.js, Vue.js, Angular, all very viable platforms for this. So choose your stack wisely, do a little research. Next, understand the latest versions and the breaking changes of different tools. For example, Tailwind CSS 4 versus Tailwind CSS 3. What are the changes? What has changed? Ensure to inform Cursor about these versions. Or when you create Next.js from a CLI tool, for example, just ask it to use Tailwind CSS straight from the CLI tool so you don't have to have Cursor try to match these version numbers. If you have to do it, I would research the version numbers and compatibility manually prior to the vibe coding session and specify them in my prompt. You do this only once in a while. You don't create new apps every day. You create it once, and then you keep adding features to the app, right? So the first time when you're creating the app from a blank slate, it's important that you prompt Cursor with the right version numbers, or create it with a CLI tool, or use one of the boilerplate stacks from GitHub so that it comes pre-configured with a number of tools that already work well together. Then include as many rules and tasks as you can, MDC files for Cursor, for the platforms, for your coding preferences. I mentioned one called history.mdc. It's important to keep a log for continuity between vibe coding sessions. You're going to use Cursor and vibe coding for the next number of months or even years. So Cursor needs to know from where you started and where you headed. That's very important. Invest in writing good prompts. This is such an important thing. You can always get better at writing prompts. It seems to me that it's a form of art now. It's prompt engineering, but there's a form of art to it. The more you learn, the more you practice, the better you get at prompt writing. And finally, find ways to optimize Cursor premium prompts. And my strategy for this is create complex agentic tasks with Cursor, but when you have point-to-point debugging or issues where you need to discover a particular problem or solution to a problem, then I use Visual Studio Code with Copilot, and I choose one of the models included like Claude 3.7, because then I can keep my premium prompts from Cursor for larger tasks or features end to end, while I can debug small issues with the unlimited plan from Copilot, which is $10 a month. So you can optimize this any way you like, but I've ended up not using Cursor for every little small question, and I've switched to Visual Studio Copilot. You can have two IDEs side by side or on different monitors, so you can perform different actions in these IDEs. Good. Now let's summarize. First of all, Cursor can boost your productivity. It took us about 2 hours end to end to create this. However, if you were to code everything from scratch with the agent, with the API and everything else with the React app, this could have taken you days. So it easily saved us at least 10 times. Secondly is planning and discipline is essential. Vibe coding sessions. Now I like to spend about 2 to 3x time planning the session to executing it. So if my vibe coding session is planned for 2 hours, I like to spend 4 to 6 hours preparing for it. And that means researching the tools, researching my feature, writing some basic feature descriptions, or even user stories using something like Claude or ChatGPT, so that I have the prompts ready and I have the information. Once I sit in front of Cursor, I can give it the best information possible to get the best outcome from the tool. Prompt engineering, we already talked about it. Create reusable assets is very important. Once you start creating these MDC rules, the rules and task files will become your golden source. You can carry them from project to project. In all honesty, once you create them in the beginning, small updates along the way will be all that you need to do. You don't have to maintain MDC files, but it's important that Cursor understands your preferences, your architectural guidelines, and that's how it creates every feature. Next is iteration. Iterate fast, get that feedback from the tool, learn, study prompt engineering, study tools, learn new tools, and incorporate them into the process. Do not be afraid to change or refactor the application either on a feature basis or even on a tool basis. Say after a while you're not happy with Tailwind CSS, you can experiment creating a new branch to refactor the entire project to another UI library. Now, I do not recommend that. That's why it's important to set aside time to do a proper research for your tech stack. But I also know that it happens in real life. You end up changing databases, you end up changing UI libraries or some other integration. Cursor is a great tool for doing these large-scale refactorings because it knows the context, it has all the files in the context, and it can go into agentic mode and update hundreds, if not thousands of files and just say, I'm done. All you need to have is a solid set of tests and solid prompts, and then retest the app and make sure everything works just as expected. It's really important, but iteration, learning, and improving is going to be key. We've come to the end of this video, so thanks for sticking around. We've shown that taking a structured approach to vibe coding with Cursor can provide a serious advantage when building AI-powered systems. From writing that perfect prompt to seeing our hotel assistant come to life with PydanticAI, FastAPI, and React, it's pretty amazing what you can achieve in just a couple of hours. If you found this walkthrough helpful, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments, what are you building with Cursor? Are you using it for AI agents like our hotel assistant, maybe full stack apps, or something completely different that I should cover next? Until next time, keep building amazing products and happy vibe coding.